Thank you, everybody, for letting us have a couple of hours of your Tuesday morning. And this is the webinar series of retooling the DV Housing First Toolkit. Yeah, with the second pillar. So your host, my name is Jacqueline Hidalgo Mendez, and I am the housing coordinator for WSCADV. And I can let Linda introduce her wonderful self.
I'm Linda Olson, and I have been working on DV Housing First at the Coalition for the past 10 years. And I'm just so incredibly happy that Jackie is joining me on this endeavor, and that Laurel and Kira are both here. Kira from the Salvation Army, who was one of the original DV Housing First pilot agencies, and of course, all of you. Thank you for being here.
And actually, Linda, do you mind actually, and I didn't tell you this before, but do you mind actually doing some land recognition?
Yes. This is an important part of WSCADV and so many organizations and public entities now is to recognize the original inhabitants of this land. And for us here in the Puget Sound area, it would be the Coastal Salish people. Close to me, where I live in Everett, there is the Tulalip Reservation, which has a number of different tribes that have gathered there to live. And in Seattle, there, of course, would be the Duwamish. So we recognize and honor the original inhabitants of this land and appreciate the land and try to be good stewards of it, for heaven's sakes. Thank you.
Okay, so this is the third webinar for this series, and as you may or may not, again, you don't have to attend each and every single one of the webinars, so we might have new individuals on here, or we may have individuals that were also a part of the first two that were on Thursday. So the first one, we kind of went over building capacity and being able to be prepared and being ready for domestic violence housing approach and the model. And then in the afternoon on Thursday, we kind of reviewed over the services, the pillar of services with regards to service-driven, trauma-informed, and mobile advocacy. Today, we're going to be reviewing the flexible financial assistance pillar, and then this evening, or afternoon, I should say, we're going to be going over the community engagement pillar. As a reminder, Housing First is more so a philosophy. It's a way of thinking and really honoring someone's hope for housing. So these pillars are on the platform of safety and stable housing. So we can begin with what is flexible financial assistance. So financial assistance is used in many ways to address whatever barriers exist between the survivor with safe and stable housing. So when I think about this and I reflect on the flexibility of it and financial assistance component with regards to advocacy, I can't help but really think about the partnership that's really needed. And how important it is to have the partnership with the survivor as well as the advocate. And advocates are truly so, their work is so incredibly important when it comes to understanding the risk analysis for each individual survivor, whether their decision is wanting to stay or to leave, as well as really making sure to understand their main priorities as well as their main concerns. Not only that, right, but everything that they're going through is more so layers to this onion, if you would kind of metaphorically want to put it, on top of different life circumstances, whether it be taking into consideration their parental responsibilities, the resources that they have, but we can get into that in a little bit too, as well as different cultural factors for each individual survivor. With respect to this partnership, also understanding the survivors' plans is so incredibly important for advocacy, as well as understanding the their previous past plans, because we know that so many of these cases are, or it's the case that when it comes to the survivor coming to an agency, it's not their first or second attempt to kind of manage everything that they're going through. So really understanding their previous plans and the effects of their plans, as well as their current resources and or primary risk and issues that they want to address as well. But advocacy in this case is so important, and it also can additionally open the door to additional advocacy services that are survivor driven. We kind of touched on that on Thursday, but really when we talk about being survivor driven, it's really listening and understanding to the survivor, and avoiding more so service defined services, which are advocates basically fitting the survivor into services that are available without really understanding their plans and their needs, or even also additionally avoiding advocate defined services, which are more so advocates fitting them into what they think is best for them. So it's really that partnership, going back to it. Okay, why flexible funding? So we know that domestic violence is the leading cause of homelessness for women and children. So many survivors can avoid homelessness if they have access to immediate funds coupled with housing advocacy and support, of course. And so we know that evaluations have shown that direct funds to those in need do have immediate and long-term positive impacts with this assistance. So with regards to flexibility and how these funds are used, how these funds are used really does make the difference. We've heard from survivors and agencies, but are also our advocates just go ahead and always, they're really good at letting us know how flexible financial assistance really changes the relationship that they have with the survivor in so many positive ways. So we know that immediate crisis can have a cascading impact for someone without financial or social safety nets as well, which many times is the case for our survivors. And having the flexibility to use the funds really does help us in addressing the barriers that exist between the survivor and housing stability that can be direct and indirect. So when we say direct, it can include paying rent or even paying back rent, specifically directly related to housing, and then indirect options as well, such as helping pay for transportation so that the survivor can have regular or consistent access to a car so that they could go to work and then be able to pay for their housing, or even indirect services such as childcare, or even fixing your car in different ways as well. So this slide really just goes more into flexible financial assistance with respect to funds being used to support housing, employment, survivor safety, as well as other critical needs that the survivor may need. The level of need and the amount of financial assistance is really determined in full partnership with the survivor. So again, really highlighting how important it is to have that partnership. These levels can be varying. I think that there's just, to make it a little bit more clear, it can be more simpler. So lower level ones that are kind of described as light touches, which include one-time services involving just minimal mobile advocacy or minimal costs. An example of this can be maybe changing a lock or replacing a car battery. So changing a lock to the home so that the person who led them to get help, so the abuser doesn't have access to going inside the house anymore, or replacing a car battery, again, helping with that transportation. The next level up would be more medium touches. So this would include more having the additional mobile advocacy in addition to the light touch needs, so including legal and support services for the survivor. And then more higher touch levels can include substantial survivor-driven or survivor-centered mobile advocacy for longer-term financial investments. Yeah, and additional assistance may be provided based on changing needs of the survivor. Again, this when the advocate and the survivor make their safety plan and make their plans to go on to safe and stable housing, it's not usually the case that everything is going to be working completely as to plan, and there's always changes that are happening. So really evolving the plan to meet the needs of the survivor and along with what the survivor wants as well. All of this, and also keeping in mind that there shouldn't be any requirements to receive the flexible financial assistance. So there shouldn't be any goals to meet for the survivor or any services that they are mandated to participate in to receive them. Yeah, so these are just more examples of flexible funding, and we kind of have touched on a couple already. So again, this, and of course, this doesn't have all of the different kind of flexible funding options. These are just examples. So we have moving expenses, whether it's moving to wherever they're currently located with the abuser to the emergency shelter, from emergency shelter onto a more stable housing phase. Car repair, again, we kind of already have touched on. First month's rent, last month's rent, as we know, a lot of landlords do like to collect both. Every lease is different, but a lot of them do have both, and it is the case for many of our survivors that their abuser may or may not have additionally used coercions with regards to their finances. So a lot of these survivors don't have that kind of money saved up, and if they do, they may have lost access to it as well. Storage unit fees, utilities, paying back rent. This kind of is also related to helping with debt. And sometimes it's not even necessarily their own debt, but maybe perhaps an example of this could be with one of the survivors that I had worked with. Their abuser would constantly be charging things to her name, opening credit cards without her knowing. And then when she would be applying to a specific an apartment complex, it showed up that she had so much debt that she had not even known that it had been accumulating over the years. This could also be medical bills, childcare. Do we have any? Yeah.
I just thought in terms of, again, looking at audience participation, particularly in this area, there are often questions about the flexibility of this money, and that can be, as we'll talk about later in a slide at the end, driven by funders in terms of just how flexible you can be. But I am just curious, I haven't seen anything in the chat box yet, and that's kind of my job to watch that today. And I'm wondering, does anybody out there have great examples? Unique, quirky sorts of things like tattoo removal or sewing machines, or what are some examples that you all might have had?
I can speak to that, Linda, if I may.
Yeah.
I'm here in Seattle for Salvation Army domestic violence programs, and we're probably luckier than most in that we get governmental funding from the city of Seattle, King County, and the United Way, and some other small private funds. And so we're able to use the different criteria that accompany each funding creatively. And so, for instance, the two of the fund sources, both the United Way in King County and the city of Seattle, allow us to pay moving expenses and first month's rent or move-in expenses, and they also allow us to eliminate some back rent. in the last year, they asked us to keep the expenditure for each person or household to $2,000, which really isn't enough. And so, but however, if I write to the various contract monitors, they will allow me to make an exception if I detail why I need to. But in terms of some of the things we've done that are a little unusual, we had a lady recently who had some fragile health issues. She was over 60 and had COPD, and she was experiencing homelessness and DV and was very fearful of going into any type of a congregate shelter situation, or indeed a non-congregate shelter situation had that been available. And she had a boat and she really wanted to stay on the boat herself and self-isolate, but she had no money for the docking fees to dock the boat. And also she had some difficulties with, she has a skin condition. She requires to have a set of totally clean clothes every day. And so we were able to use our flexible funding with the city of Seattle. They give us about 30,000 every year of flexible funding, which they're extraordinarily flexible about. And, you know, the Housing First philosophy, certainly ours, asks the survivor, what's your uppermost concern right now? Like, what is it that you're worried about right now? And she said, I need money to get that boat in a safe place. So we said, sure, and paid for her docking fees. And then she was very concerned about having to go to the laundromat and the fact that some weren't open and how she would keep her clothes clean. So we got online and found some type of a portable washing machine for clothing and center detergent and a drying rack. And then because she was so cut off socially and found it so difficult to access our services, we also sent her a fairly cheap Amazon Fire tablet and organized the kind of low cost FTC internet services for her, which you can get for $9.99 a month. And so with that, we were able to keep in touch with her and deliver teleservices and emotional support and talk to her about her DV situation and her longer plan terms, but also keep her safe and secure in that boat. And we also just got groceries delivered to her. We have some donated Safeway cards, so we gave, you know, we just used those to get groceries delivered to the dock, and it worked out just great. So, you know, I think regardless of how one uses the money, if one keeps in mind safety, a safe place to stay, and also what is it that the survivor's main worry is around now, and using the money to assist in that way, and also their needs for human connection, particularly in the time of COVID. Those are the things we have uppermost on our mind now with how we spend the money.
Yeah, those are such creative ways. Thank you, Kira.
Sure.
Does anybody else have any examples?
Are people using money on car repair costs at all?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm seeing Joelle from DVS Everett, DVS Snohomish County, where they provide basic housing starter kits to those that need them, beds and bedding, dishes, towels, and cleaning supplies. Mm-hmm. So that's a great example of, you know, the flexible financial assistance that don't fit into a lot of grants or public funding sources.
Yeah. Right. We have some partnerships with local stores, and they give us kind of floor models of things that haven't been sold. And so we really find, kind of like Joel, that when you help a person into housing, if you can provide nice things for the home to set up the home, and really, it really helps the person just feel like they're in their own home with nice new fresh towels and linens and stuff like that, and just engenders a feeling of pride in their home. Maybe for the first time in a long time, they can invite a guest over and not feel that it's shabby or broken or that type of thing. So we spend a lot of our resources on what we call home setup, and we buy beds for people and bed frames, and we always buy a futon for the living room, because I couldn't do without some type of a couch, sofa type thing in my living room. Yeah. And then we use our community partners for bed linens and soft furnishings and rugs and pots and pans and kind of various Christmas giving trees we have around. We put as tags on the giving trees household items like a set of towels, a set of pots and pans, silverware, those kind of things, and explain why they're needed. And we get a very good response to that. So we kind of stock up those things.
Well, I am just loving what Shannon Snap is saying to everybody in the chat box in terms of buying for an undocumented women for, I guess, plural, some cooking equipment so that she could support herself. Yeah. And of course, we've experienced that throughout our coalition. Many of our member organizations have supported survivors in that way so that they could make money on things like food trucks and discrete food operations out of their home and have an income. So Shannon, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. Okay. So some individuals here may already be familiar with the pilot project, the pilot Domestic Violence Housing First project. So in 2009, WSCADV launched a 5-year pilot project testing the approach, and the approach was used survivor-driven, trauma-informed mobile advocacy, flexible financial assistance with community engagement and housing stability to get survivors of domestic violence into safe and stable housing as quickly as possible, and then providing the necessary support that was needed in order to rebuild their lives. And this is just some information that was revealed through the pilot project. So the average amount that a survivor was provided with was about $1,250, but it did range from $40 to about $10,000. For the pilot, we also just understood more how flexible financial assistance really allowed the agencies that were part of the pilot to reach broader group of survivors who perhaps before weren't able to be reached, by offering more options for housing stability. And advocates could meet the needs of the survivors that were not served in emergency shelter. So this is a quote. And I believe, Linda, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it was from a DV advocate. And it really doesn't take a whole lot of money with advocacy to help someone and change their lives. So when it comes to more impacts of flexible funding on staff, it led increased staff morale because there were no longer any more restrictions, and advocates weren't needing to be confined by restrictions in order to help their survivors. And then when I think about this lead, I really can't help but reflect on the sometimes overwhelming traumas that advocates confront every single day. So there's often unrecognized this toll taken on advocates working to make our world a better place, to make it more safe. And working with survivors and really being stewards of trauma may lead the advocates to feeling tired, feeling numb, or like we can never do enough. And so I can't help but just appreciate just the impact that it does to our advocates as well while they're going through and feeling all these things. It's usually individuals that are really so empathetic and kind of, not that they would ever be able to understand what the survivors are going through, but they do empathize with it. So being able to say yes to simple requests that they weren't able to kind of felt like they can manage before just makes it so much better, not only for the survivors, but also for the staff at the agencies. And this is a quote by one of the executive directors at an agency, and it's the happiest money advocates have ever had. So wow.
For those of you who were with us for the first webinar, this quote is a Beckett Corby quote, and it's one that she says frequently and often whenever she is asking for flexible financial assistance.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if I could just second that.
Yeah.
We find, and I imagine other directors too, that we have quite a high staff turnover. But in our community advocacy program, which is where we run our DV Housing First program, I tend to have advocates stay longer, and that's the reason why. I think that somebody can call on the phone and say, look, you probably can't help me with this, but I need a double stroller, you know, urgently, and I can't get one anywhere and I can't afford one. And they're like, okay, well, have you got, you know, if you want to get on Amazon and let's look, I'll get on too, and let's look at which one you want. Oh, you'd like that one? Okay. You know, they use the corporate credit card to go in and send it to them. And they're like, yep, you'll have it in 2 days. And that's very nice. Because there was a time, perhaps 10 years ago, where it was just like, no, we've money to help with rent and move in and kind of very basic things, but we don't have money for $300 or $400 strollers. And now there's a certain limit that trained advocates can make a decision on without having to consult their supervisor around those basic things that people need. They're trusted with the information on the corporate credit card to go online and just get that thing sent, you know, get mattresses sent, get bed frames, you know, those mattresses in a box, and just get the stuff to the people quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And it just really helps, you know, like sometimes we've had clients just cry on the phone because the things that we're worried about and ashamed about were that they didn't have beds for their children. So I definitely feel for those people who are just developing this model, that having going online for an awful lot of purchases and having a corporate credit card that can be used, obviously with all the important documentary backup, really helps to get things sent to people.
So what we've learned in 2019 update. So Domestic Violence Housing First demonstration is an evaluation that is a strategic initiative building off of the success of the 5-year pilot project. The demonstration and research project is working to bring together just different domestic violence housing and homelessness providers and advance the model really for intervention. So in 2005, 8 domestic violence organizations in 2 regions of Washington state were selected to integrate the approach into the organizations and advocacy structures. So the 2019 report really describes how the organizations have implemented the domestic violence housing first approach and data from the demonstration project. Additionally, with including the findings of the impact on the survivors as well as their children. So basically evidence to support what flexible financial assistance and what it can do. And then, so these are what we've learned from those 2019 reports. So there was a total of 2,566 unique disbursements, totaling up to $875,000 about. But these disbursements, once again, they had a range. It ranged from 56 cents to about $5,400, averaging to a survivor $340.33. So there was 1,452 recipients to the total disbursements. And on the next slide, we have just the big impact that the flexible financial assistance made for the demonstration reports as of 2019. So ultimately 45% of the survivors really remained and were able to stay in their homes with the assistance, and 33% received help with housing preparation costs. 7% moved from the shelter to being housed, as well as from one home to another, and 6% moved from homelessness to house. So this is a quote from a DV advocate, and really, just as to also note on here, we really like to, yes, look at the information that we're learning, but also put a story to the information that we're getting from these reports. So quotes are always so wonderful because you actually kind of get a sense for it from the actual individuals who are a part of these, and not just seeing numbers, right? So this one says, with the DVHF dollars, we were able to help one survivor stay in her home by paying 2 months of rent and changing the locks on her door. Her car had also broken down, so she couldn't get to work. We helped fix her car, and she was able to continue to work. She's still in her home and has her job because of DVHF. The demographics from this report also, the majority were identified as white European Americans, about a third were Hispanic and Latinx, 24% identified as Black African or Black African American or African descent, and almost a third identified as an immigrant or a refugee. Okay.
I just have a question with that, sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
So those agencies, were those spread around Washington and encompass rural agencies and urban agencies too, or?
So it was both a combination of urban and rural. It was in King County and then South Central Washington.
I see. Okay. Yeah. I feel that 27% identified as immigrant or refugee. I know when we were involved in the project initially, I think our number was less than that, maybe about 20% or something. So that represents an increase.
Yeah, I think it's definitely because of the South Central region being a part of the demonstration.
Right.
Yeah. So when it comes to the core components for flexible funding, I like to think of this as like a cake, right? You have your cake, but of course, when you bake a cake, you have these core ingredients that need to go to any cake. And then when it comes to like after you have the flour or the eggs, you can also make it your own as well, and kind of tailoring it unique to the survivor, with that partnership with the advocate, of course. So the core components for flexible funding programs for the survivors are having low barrier access. So again, reducing obstacles, survivor-driven advocacy, really valuing the role of the survivor, of course, being flexible, and then having swift dissemination of funds. And we're actually going to go into each one of them. So when it comes to reducing the obstacles, advocates and survivors together in that partnership really determine when flexible funding can assist with stabilizing safe housing. Assessment process is needed in order to determine what a survivor really needs, is driven back to the relationship with the survivor rather than just a form of checking off the boxes. So really listening to the survivor again, highlighting on that partnership in order to work together, and not so much just taking away the uniqueness of all of the individual life and circumstances that the survivor is really going through, which no checklist can really get to. And then, so there's typically no cap on the amount that the survivor can request or limit of times that the survivor can request support either. When it comes to survivor-driven advocacy, both the advocates really use the relationship building as well as trauma-informed support with the survivor in that partnership to determine the kind of advocacy and funding needed to support ongoing stability, offer safe planning before, during, and after. So really monitoring that, the flexible funding that's provided as well. And this goes back to that plan that we all know of, according to that plan that they developed with the survivor, and then coupling the flexible funding with housing advocacy, leveraging the financial assistance in order to increase the amount of advocacy and services. So again, this the building the relationships and engaging the survivors and services when, of course, it's appropriate and they have the capacity to do so. So this isn't a requirement. And when it comes to getting it into the hands of the survivor as fast as possible, according to the agency's protocols, the funds should be typically provided within the first 24 to 48 hours. And this is to ensure that it's effectively responding to what the survivor needs in the crisis of moments that they're in when they come to the agency. I had previously mentioned that many times this isn't the very first time they've tried reaching out to help, or not necessarily from the agency, but from other sources. So typically they come to the agencies when they're in crisis. These examples for allowing for swift dissemination can be managed by minimizing the layers of organizational bureaucracy. So this would may be an in the agency conversation and really kind of seeing the protocols and kind of taking into account everything that's needed in order to get the funds to the survivors, and then questioning why. But placing the advocate in charge of a budget with discretion. So really valuing the advocate in terms of having the responsibility with the budget, and I guess having, I want to say, faith that they are going to be using it accordingly for the survivor and in that partnership with the survivor, but as well as utilizing private funding with minimal restrictions or parameters to offer greater flexibility with the assistance as well.
Kiara's got something in the chat box that I'll just mention to everyone. And why don't you all kind of think about this? And perhaps it can be a later conversation when we have more time too, but what's the most unusual thing you have ever used flex funds to buy for a survivor? And this is the kind of question that if we were all in person, I would have had something like chocolate or some sort of little treat or award for someone who can come up with the most off the top sort of out of the norm response for a unique survivor request. So something to think about, and we can do this later, and maybe we can still do that award sort of thing in some Zoomy sort of way.
Everybody can definitely expect an air like a social distancing high five. Okay, so I'll go on to so some common challenges and concerns with regards to flexible financial assistance. First, we have supporting survivors when flexible funding runs dry. I actually want to open this up as a question to those who have implemented to some capacity flexible financial assistance. Like, how does that look in your program and agency when the funding is running a little low, and how do you monitor it and keep track of it? And
I just want to name in particular the challenge when flexible financial assistance is running low. And there is that tendency to maybe with a very little money try and stretch it out. And unfortunately, with that stretch it out sort of approach, the gatekeeper role might come in. and there can be those dynamics of whose need is the worthiest, which person might be the one most deserving. And I think it's a hard place for advocates and agencies to be in, and
Mhm.
something to certainly reflect on as you're putting together your flexible financial assistance programs, of how can you think about that in a different way. And I know everybody has some unique ways to do that. So maybe that's another reflective sort of thing that can come up a little bit later.
Yeah.
I'm not sure exactly how to answer that question, but what comes to mind is the importance of building relationships with funding agents or funding organizations in the county that
Mhm.
you're in or the city. I've only been with this agency for about a year, so I had the benefit of inheriting a lot of the results of the hard work laid down by people that preceded me to try to just explain to people in our county what it was like to be a survivor of domestic violence or be somebody in the middle of it in the moment. And so we actually do have some groups that we can just go to and appeal for money from in order to do things for people. I'm not sure how else to avoid the gatekeeper role than that to just simply know that we have people we can go to when the money runs out and say, would you please just keep trusting us? But that's a hard that's hard work that just has to continually be repeated. You know, so
Continually be what? I'm sorry.
it has to continually be repeated.
Repeated.
It's like if you want a white fence, you have to keep painting. So, or if you know whatever color fence you want, you have to keep painting that fence or it changes color. So, same with the flexible funding and the sources of that. There's just no substitute for the continued effort to build a sympathetic funding base, a local donation base. Anyway, you asked the question, so that's what came to my mind.
Yeah.
That's the only way I know to avoid the gatekeeper role and
Thank you for that.
avoid the sense of poverty that we tend to drift into, like we just don't have the money, so we can't.
Thank you for that. And I love that you also took into account and really acknowledge those community partnerships. And I hope that you're going to be on this afternoon to learn more about that pillar as well, and to continue that conversation, because it's so important to have and establish and keep those community partnerships, how you were saying. So thank you. Linda, I actually have a question for you with regards to the gatekeeper and flexible funding running dry. Do you see any patterns, or do you notice anything when it comes to agencies who take more so the approach of trying to hold on to what they have when they see it running low and kind of spreading it out, versus the agencies who when it runs dry, it just runs dry, and finding alternative ways to help the survivors?
You know, not so much specifically. I think what we hear is through focus groups.
Yeah.
A part of that final report included focus groups and the agencies participating. And of course, having a certain familiarity with the agency itself and where they might be with money, and you know, just some of the things that came through would indicate when survivors are not feeling quite as you know, valued, I guess is the word I'm thinking of. And this can be in an agency that advocates are doing wonderful work most all of the time, but you can sense when there is that hesitancy or concern about flexible financial assistance. And there's a huge difference between saying, no, we really don't have the means to do that right now, versus maybe hesitating. In small communities, survivors know when somebody gets money and other people don't.
Mhm.
Anyway, I think it's really nebulous, and it's a difficult one to pinpoint, but mostly I think it's just hard for advocates when they are placed in that situation, and it really goes to the agency leadership, management, of thinking about, and Dave's wonderful example of what they do up in the San Juans when that happens. And I've heard that from other organizations, so that advocates don't have to feel at such a disadvantaged place when they're working with survivors.
So when it comes to minimizing, this would be internal bureaucracy in order to facilitate the speedy payment, how we kind of just touched on there. It's okay to challenge the internal bureaucracy and really ask why those steps are in place when you needing to actually disperse and disseminate those funds. But that's all within the agency as well, and having conversations within the agencies and programs. But also conveying to potential funders how critical the core components are to the outcomes for the survivors. And Dave did mention this too, and how important it is for them to really understand. And it's taking this opportunity to educate and to inform how flexible funding can be useful and supportive, but then also what an impact and what a difference it's making to survivors and families in our own communities too. And these are a couple of potential issues to take into consideration. So when it comes to accounting for cash grants made directly to the survivor, we're remembering how to record the grants in order to satisfy auditing and funding requirements, to make sure that we're also adhering to the core program principles of flexible financial assistance, as well as with respect to domestic violence housing first to that approach, and understanding potential impact that grants that some flexible financial assistance may have for the survivor in terms of their eligibility for public benefits as well as for tax reporting requirements. It's important to understand the limitations also attached to funding sources, because some funders do have some legislations and limitations around how the funding is spent. So it's taking this opportunity to ask, are there opportunities for advocacy and funder education? So really asking the funders why there are these limitations and what are the ways that we can change these terms if they really don't seem reasonable, but maybe they are. It's a good conversation to have, especially with regards to having restrictions and limitations.
This is my turn, and I just wanted to acknowledge that there are a couple of suggestions in the chat box of great over-the-top ways that flexible financial assistance has been used. So I'm looking forward to our even broader conversation and maybe some more examples coming up. You know, just talking about the money can often be difficult, and it is best when an organization can really look at the whole variety of ways flexible financial assistance is funded. I will say that over the past 10 to 15 years that there has been a lot of work done by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to promote flexible financial assistance. The work of this particular project has also influenced public funders in ways that they are also much more interested in providing flexible assistance, financial assistance. And that starts right with VOCA funding, as well as some of the emergency solutions grant money trickling down to our state. Commerce has its own little pot of diversion money, and many organizations and their local entities are looking more at how flexible things can be, again, based on the evidence. In the state of California, they basically took a huge chunk of their VOCA money and made it into DV Housing First initiatives in a way that there was flexible financial assistance funded by VOCA. So it's fascinating how that can happen, and different things for people to really think about as you're setting it up. The public-private funding partnership, knowing that you've got some public funds that you can apply for that can do a limited amount of financial assistance, and then looking at the private money. Again, going back to foundations like the Gates Foundation, Medina Foundation in Washington State is also one, and I know that there are others that are very happy to entertain this sort of approach, especially when there's a public partner that they can look to. Charitable foundation, again, looking at all of those opportunities in your community and get acquainted with people. We have been finding more and more that foundation leadership really wants to understand the needs of people who benefit from their foundation money. They want to understand the needs of survivors and are very interested in becoming partners and making sure that they can fill a very unique niche for domestic violence agencies. Appeals to the community, using that strengths-based marketing approach. By this, I mean the idea of those auctions or those brochures, those different flyers that go out, and being able to talk about how helpful it is to have money to get survivors back on their feet. In our world, we have tended to appeal to people from that place of crisis a survivor is in, often that poor, battered woman with the black eyes and the bruised faces. And of course, that is a reality that we face daily. And we're encouraging folks not only to use that particular strategy with your communities, but thinking about the strengths-based approach of what it is for survivors to receive a boost, a help, a stable place to live, money in a way that can really get them on their feet, and how they can become that contributing member back in the community. So it's strength-based marketing for this particular approach, and I realize that many of our agencies have had a great deal of success with that. Survivor-led funding strategies. I've been kind of excited by listening to ideas across the state when survivors benefit from this money, and then they get all excited about figuring out their own community organizing ways to put together fundraising drives that could benefit other survivors in the organization that they had received support from. And then, of course, state, local, or federal funding. And it's important to look at every single grant source that you are applying for, and to identify where flexible assistance, financial assistance, could be worked into that grant. There are times when agencies don't always realize that there are things for financial assistance that could be a part of your line item budgets and are within the allowable costs of the grants. And so policies, this has been a huge topic. We've been hearing questions about policies and procedures from really all over the country. It has also been a question that our VOCA funders will ask when they're looking for grants from people from different agencies that are wishing to do financial assistance. whether it's emergency financial assistance or perhaps some housing relocation, some of the transitional housing principles. And so there is a question of what kind of policies do you have? And I tend to go low on the policies, you know, a little light, because they can often become ironclad rules that people hesitate to adapt and change. But I think looking at policies to think about on the organizational level starts with who is your target population. I would assume survivors. Is that a part of your mission statement? There are times when people will not serve folks who have been out of a relationship for a period of time. There is a priority for recent domestic violence situations. Some prioritize survivors with children. So I think looking at where are you there? Some of it might have to do with your agency capacity. But whenever you start eliminating survivors for a variety of different reasons, simply because they don't always share everything with you in the initial phone call, there can be a certain amount of shame and embarrassment. And so thinking about what your policy is as far as who you're serving. In the world of HMIS and our coordinated entries, we're often pushed to the prioritizing vulnerability. And how can that happen? Again, we don't always know the different circumstances of a survivor, so trying to score and prioritize can be difficult. All of these things are something to consider when you put policies together of whom you're serving. Do you have a policy about the DV Housing First approach? Do you really believe that housing is a right for everybody, including survivors? There are still a lot of programs, both in the housing world and in the DV world, that say they should be housing ready. When somebody is out of the DV situation and made a commitment to end the relationship, then they're housing ready. If they're clean and sober, then they're housing ready. Maybe they need to have mental health issues taken care of in order to be deemed housing ready. So it is that matter of your policies related to that DV Housing First approach that says no barriers, we'll work with them, we'll work to eliminate barriers, and we're not going to have people hanging around homeless, often returning to really unsafe, abusive situations because we don't think they're housing ready yet. And I would really invite conversation. This can be a hot topic, and would absolutely love to hear more from folks out there. Funder requirements. In your policies, when you do have major funding sources from public entities, it's important to recognize that so that they know the basic things that direct their grant making are being recognized by the agency. So when VOCA money, for example, is at play, you know there are certain limitations and restrictions in terms of what money can be used for. And there was a whole webinar in April related to that. And if anybody wants a copy of those slides, please let us know. We can get that out to you. I put in adequate cash flow because this is what I am understanding now a huge issue. Foundations will give you a cash grant to the agency up front. You get the money right off the top, and you don't have to worry about whether it's there or not. You know whether it's there or not. Unfortunately, public funding sources are based on reimbursement. And I have been so sad to hear of organizations leaving money on the table that they requested and were granted because they didn't have adequate cash flow. They couldn't do the disbursement upfront. So I think having that, not so much a bigger agency policy, but a part of your financial management policies of how do you ensure that you have the cash flow? that you can really be free with the money that you know is coming your way, that you've been granted, without going into a major organizational crisis. Agency audit expectations. No matter how you disperse that money, again, there needs to be that financial management policy related to documentation. Unfortunately, we know of occasions around the country where money has been misused by an advocate. And so it is important to try and balance the incredible trust we have to give advocates with how are we documenting? How are we making sure that there is the checks and balances without putting in too many layers and trappings of requirements that slow the whole process down? And finally, equity. Just that recognition within an organization, and perhaps a policy that indicates the organization needs to be serving its community, and that the levels of that service needs to be reflected on each area in the organization. So if there is a predominantly Latinx population that is being served, that needs to be recognized and presented, apparent on the board, on line staff, on management, so that we know the agency is truly responsive and reflective to the entire community. Something that policy-wise for every organization to look at in terms of not only the population makeup, but who are they serving and what does their organization look like to the community and the population they're serving. So those are just some really basic ones. I know that other policies might come as a result of input from board, from community, but my encouragement always is not to make it pages long and so burdensome that you're not able to get anything done. And at this point, I just want to introduce Kiera. The Salvation Army was one of our pilot projects. They did some incredibly amazing work. And their progress, the place they started with this particular approach and the place that they are now has been an incredible progression of learning, great leadership by Kiera, willingness to test things, kind of figure out the evidence behind something, and be able to go to a very, very large organization and promote flexibility within some of the structures of that organization, which I don't think is any easy task. So I think just with a whole lot of respect, I'd like to introduce Kiera to share more of her reflections, and certainly to solicit more conversation and questions from you all so that we can all learn from each other. That's one of the main points of this webinar series. So, Kiera.
Well, thank you, Linda. That's very kind of you. I thought I'd start off with a couple of examples of things that we've done with flexible funding. We bought a wig for somebody, and it was a lady who had, been experiencing hair loss, and she was trying to get back into the workplace, and it was really affecting her confidence. But she didn't want, just kind of the $100 ones, or whatever, that are okay, but, not great. She really wanted a good one. And one of the philosophies, I think, behind Housing First is to say, what is your most pressing concern right now? What in this moment can we help you with? And a lot of the time, sure, it's going to be housing stability and economic stability. This was related both to her confidence and to ultimately what she thought was entering the workforce and to promote her economic stability. And so we ended up spending, I think it was about $600 to get her, a real professional wig and professionally fitted and that type of thing. And when she came into the office the next time, we didn't recognize her. It was just gorgeous. And you could tell she was so happy and far less self-conscious. And at that point, then she wanted to work with us on applying for jobs and getting interviews and things like that. So that was great. Another thing we've bought for people is people who have a lot of PTSD and are leery around working with others. And we had a lady who lived in her van and carried out her economic activity from there, which was DoorDash and Instagram and things. But she wanted us to buy a car generator so that she could have a heat source in the car. And also it could operate an oxygen mask that she needed at night. And so we bought that for her. And most other requests for flexible funding are related to housing and that kind of thing. But what we really have found success with is not, talking to a person about their housing situation and how much their rent is and what we can pay, but by saying to the survivor, how much do you think you need from us? And we've been amazed with how well people have crafted solutions when we've asked that question, because they've said, well, I can get 300 from St. Vincent de Paul and I can get 200 from my church. And I feel if you give me 600, and then if I pull 2 extra shifts, I can, and that's a lot more empowering, I think, than us saying, sure, here's a check for 1,200 or whatever. And it also allows the survivor a measure of dignity. They're just working us into their solution and not the other way around. With regard to having funders flexibilize the money for you, some of them can't, depending on the funding source, of course, especially if it's federal or BHG, but some of them, particularly cities with general funds, can really do anything with that money. And what we find is really important is using good narrative stories to say what we use the money on, why, and how that outcome was fairly transformational in terms of the survivor household's existence. And we don't just send in these reports kind of quarterly when we're supposed to send them in. We regularly will just send an email with a great story to the contract monitor, who isn't expecting to get it then and is far more likely to read it rather than, I think, if they have 30 reports all with a narrative. And so we like to give quick emails here and there, just saying so glad you've been so flexible with this money, and here's a story about how it worked, and also how the fact that it worked has actually saved our community far more money down the road. In the Salvation Army, a lot of you are from smaller agencies, but this is a very big one. It's an evangelical Christian church. I would say formerly in our DV programs, there was a slightly paternalistic attitude around money and what money could be spent on. And some of our work within the agency is involved training our counterparts in the other kind of regular homeless programs, and also having a training for our fiscal staff. And we're lucky because we've a kind of a big accounting department who cuts checks and deals with payments for us. But they were very surprised when we started asking for money, money for a laptop for someone. And, you got those weird questions like, ooh, like, how do you know they're going to use it like to do a course in the local community college? And the answer was, I don't, but they want to do a course in the local community college. So I'm going to take them at their word, just like I want a laptop to do my job. And it took a while, definitely, and ultimately, to trust survivors, and that honestly, the last thing on their mind is trying to, wrangle a free laptop from anyone. They want to get on their way and get stability and safety. and they will tell you what they need to do that. And you need to trust those voices. We do have a limit. Generally, we'll kind of hand out about 5,000 each year, and then it triggers a kind of a closer look. Also, we don't disperse. We're not allowed by our agency to actually give people cash or money. We're required to either pay the vendor or give people gift cards, you know, say for things like groceries or the pharmacy or gas or what have you. And then to pay for the larger items, to either order them online and get them delivered, or to cut checks to landlords and consumer and other type of debt collectors, which is often something that's preventing them from getting into housing. We don't have any housing readiness tests or stuff like that, because I feel everybody's ready to get into housing. Like, everybody wants to be there. And I think we've seen with the COVID crisis that when hotel rooms were made available, that those people who were living in encampments or congregate shelters or overnight shelters or anywhere else were there like, great, yes, I would absolutely love a hotel room with my own door and my own bathroom, because that would make such a difference. I don't have to be afraid at night or watching my stuff or worried about COVID and all sorts of other diseases or illnesses. And I don't know anybody I've worked with who, you know, we've said, look, you seem like if you had the money, you could go right into your own apartment and do just fine, who hasn't said, yep, you're right. Occasionally we get a person who may have a disability, may be heavily pregnant, may have like twins, and they need some childcare support and stuff like that, and supports in the home, and to be connected to community supports. But in general, it's really helped. We're in Seattle, King County, where we have a particularly difficult rental market. So we found ourselves kind of advocating with landlords to the far south of the county and far north of the county a lot of the time. And we find that survivors often come up with really great solutions themselves. Like, if they can move to Montana, their brother has a trailer on his land and the trailer needs a new roof. But if they can get that sorted out, and maybe some of their favorite paint and some new things to kind of stock at the inside of the trailer, like, they're going to have a home there and won't have to pay rent. And so, you know, we'll pay for that to happen. It's not complicated, I don't think.
Thank you, Carol. I appreciated also the comment that you made about the dignity part when it comes to survivors, and letting them keep their dignity. And it kind of is related back to avoiding that gatekeeper air quote role that's kind of tied to the person of authority, and avoiding those power structures that, you know, if we're honest, it wouldn't be the first time that they've experienced because of the person who led them to get help from the program and the agency, their abuser. So really supporting those dynamics with best practices that the agencies may be implementing. And especially it kind of brings me back to some of the survivors that I have worked with, where it was often the case that many times they were really hesitant to receive help. And I've heard comments such as, no, I don't want to be a burden, or like, no, like maybe somebody else deserves it. No, I will never be able to pay it back. I don't, you know, and it just hurts my heart sometimes hearing those comments, because it kind of makes it, it just makes it that much more apparent of what power structures and power dynamics they're used to, and that they think that that's normal. And coming to these agencies, how much it takes from them sometimes to just ask for help. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, I think people are so often ashamed to ask for help. And they've been told their esteem has been dismantled, their self-esteem, and they feel almost that they don't deserve it. So we try as quickly as we can to torpedo that notion and say, look, you know, we all pay into the social safety net at one point or another, whether we're buying something through sales tax or we're working or we're paying payroll taxes. And at a certain time, it is expected that you will take that out and fall on some difficult times through no fault of your own. So please don't feel that way. You know, everyone who comes through our door needs help, and there's no shame in needing help. Every human needs help at some stage, and we have the money to help you. So by you coming and asking for help, you're allowing us to do our job, and that makes us feel good. You know, so we usually kind of lead with that, and also say that, you know, they strike us as a resourceful person who's been surviving well enough this long, and they'll do so again. And the small help we give them is just a drop in the bucket, really, in terms of people's lifetime expenses, and, you know, that type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But I agree, it's just hard. It's ingrained in a lot of people that they shouldn't ask for financial help, you know, and many of them are super surprised when they think they're coming, you know, maybe asking us for help with rent, and then we ask them about other things, and we can say, oh, we can get you that, or we could buy that for you, or we'll send that right over. And they're amazed because they say they didn't know that type of help was out there.
Mm-hmm.
And thought they'd have to fill up all sorts of paperwork and would never kind of, it would come through, but maybe 3 months later, you know, as opposed to a few days later.
I just want to jump in there too. And I think what Kira and Jackie and I've been describing, and pretty much everyone I believe on this call knows, is that the vast majority of survivors are appreciative that dignity is important, that they never ask for more than they need, and that they hesitate to ask at all. I think that's the vast majority. That's what we deal with. And I also want to, for those that have those exceptions, because human beings are not perfect people, entities, ever. And we had a chunk last week on trauma-informed, a chunk that included traumatic brain injuries, and the fact that there are many people who do have that survival mode, who do have that place of pain and desperation, and you know, could result in one of those horror stories that I think every single one of us have at one point in time. And it becomes our job not to consider it a horror story of what just happened to the money. And I'm thinking of one situation where new tires were provided for a vehicle and were sold for drug money. That will happen. You know, that will happen. And it's a matter of, what does the advocacy look like to maintain trust, to acknowledge what was going on, to look at the situation through a trauma-informed lens, and ask the person, so how can we help make this right in a way that we all rebuild trust with one another? And so it's challenging. It can pull right into the very depths of where we might be indignant about trusting somebody and then finding that that trust was somehow betrayed. But ultimately, we all screw up. We had a major training on flexible financial assistance where it was a flat screen TV that was purchased with a large gift card rather than all of the furnishings that were needed for this home. And we talked about the flat screen TVs in our own lives, that we knew perfectly well what we needed to do with a certain chunk of money and ended up totally blowing it. Or as other people talked of, maybe that flat screen TV was an important part of the family entertainment, something for the kids. Maybe it was considered the most important thing ultimately. And that survivor was just too embarrassed to say, this is what I really, really need. So I think it's that matter of grace and trust and understanding.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Linda. Sometimes, and for so many of us, some class of a sofa and a big screen is really, it's all that I need in certain evenings when I go home. And we really recognize that our survivors don't have the money to go out to the movies or to meet a friend for dinner or go to a Starbucks or some of the more kind of luxury things that other working people may have, or people with a higher wage. And so often the television is really their only recourse for kind of comfort and entertainment. And we actually consider it vital. It's one of the first things we ask. You know, how do you consume media? Like, do you have a tablet? Do you prefer to get a screen or a monitor? If we can hook you up with kind of Wi-Fi, you know, can we buy, you know, even a 24-inch monitor for beside your bed, or, you know, that you and the kids can cuddle up on the futon. And, you know, it's so important to kind of ask, what are the things that help you relax and escape? And just like the way we now buy survivors tablets and help them with the internet, I think it's just become essential in the way we consume information and the way we pass the time. Sure, I'd love to say that, you know, wouldn't it be great if we could all go for a walk? But, you know, I live near a park. There's so many people who don't. They live in kind of recreational deserts. And sometimes I think TV is just vitally important. So, you know, we have it on our checklist. You know, if you have one, would you like one? Let's see if we can get you one. That kind of thing.
All right. Well, just looking at the chat box and the challenge, I see Joelle says 1 week of day camp for children in the summer. Awesome. Anything for kids is so critical in terms of normalizing their lives and helping support the parent. Shannon says yoga classes and other self-care, swimming, theater classes at Would-Be Playhouse. You bet. That all helps with that household stability, well-being, sense of normalcy again in their lives. And Kira, you've got tattoo equipment, so a survivor could do a side job to generate a second income.
Yeah. I found out all about tattoo equipment and inks and all sorts of things just by going online and buying this particular kit. And this lady had worked in a tattoo parlor but no longer did that and had another job. But she was able to, you know, earn a few $100 extra a week with this equipment, which just sounded great. And just to piggyback on what others have said there, you know, I think trying anything we can do to connect our survivors and their children with the local community, I think is so important. And that's one of the most important things about moving into your own place, is putting down roots and recognizing things. And so buying sports equipment for children and getting them involved in teams where they make friends and they play on the same team and they're going to the same school with the same school counselor. Like if our money can buy that kind of stability in a child's life, I think it's just the best, you know? And so we have, definitely paid for little guitars and ukuleles and football outfits and, you know, all those kind of things. And here in Seattle, we have been very lucky too with some of the jungle gyms and taekwondo and various places that run activities for children. They've been very good at giving us scholarships and, you know, so it's amazing how that has given some of the children confidence, because when you say, what do you like to do? Often they couldn't really point to something they like to do because they hadn't experienced that much. And if they say, you know, I'm learning to play the ukulele, or I'm learning martial arts, and, you know, develop mastery at something, I think that really helps.
And yeah, I appreciate you all once again for sharing your morning with us. And thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Have a great rest of your Tuesday.